My hands trembled as I applied the burgundy lipstick, the same shade I wore 43 years ago when Robert first kissed me under the elm tree behind the high school gymnasium. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman I sometimes didn't recognize. Silver hair styled in a way that made me feel dignified rather than old, laugh lines that spoke of decades of joy and sorrow, eyes that still held the spark of the 18-year-old girl who believed love conquered everything. "You don't have to do this, Mom," Sarah had said earlier that morning, her voice carrying that protective tone my children had adopted since their father passed 3 years ago. "You barely know this man anymore. People change." But that was exactly the point. I needed to know who Robert had become, just as I needed to understand who I had become in the spaces between our shared memories and this present moment where we had somehow found each other again through the maze of social media and mutual friends who still lived in our small hometown. The restaurant he chose was elegant but not pretentious, the kind of place where a woman of 64 could feel comfortable whether she arrived alone or with company. I had spent an embarrassing amount of time selecting my outfit, a navy dress that skimmed my figure without clinging, paired with the pearl earrings my late husband David had given me for our 25th anniversary. It felt like betrayal and tribute all at once, wearing David's gift to meet the man who had owned my heart before David even knew my name. I arrived 15 minutes early, a habit that had served me well through decades of PTA meetings, business presentations, and doctor's appointments. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes, seated me at a table by the window where the afternoon light softened everything it touched. I ordered a glass of Chardonnay, hoping it would calm the flutter in my chest that felt both foreign and familiar. The last time I had seen Robert, he was 22, standing on my parents' front porch with his hands shoved deep in his jeans pockets, telling me he couldn't marry me because he needed to find himself first. He was leaving for California, he said, to chase dreams that seemed more important than the life we had planned together. I had thrown my engagement ring at his feet and slammed the door, crying so hard I made myself sick. 6 months later, I met David at my cousin's wedding, and life took the path it was meant to take. Now, as I watched the restaurant door, I wondered if some stories were meant to have second chapters, or if we were simply too old and too wise to believe in fairy tale endings. My phone buzzed with a text. "Running a few minutes late, traffic is terrible, can't wait to see you, Maggie." The casual way he used my name sent a shiver through me. For 43 years, I had been Margaret to most people, Mrs. Morrison to my children's teachers, Mom to my kids, and Sweetheart to David. But I had been Maggie to Robert, always Maggie, said in a voice that made me feel like the most beautiful girl in the world. I sipped my wine and watched the other diners. An elderly couple at the corner table sat in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing a smile over their shared dessert. A middle-aged woman dining alone read a book between courses, completely content in her own company. I envied her composure, her apparent indifference to the opinions of others. At 64, I still worried about what people thought when they saw a woman dining alone, though I knew better. 20 minutes past our agreed time, I began to wonder if he would show. Perhaps this had been a mistake after all. Perhaps some doors were meant to stay closed. I was reaching for my purse, ready to signal the waitress for the check, when I heard a voice behind me. "Maggie?" I turned, and there he was, Robert. But not the Robert of my memories, frozen forever at 22, with dark hair and broad shoulders and eyes full of restless ambition. This Robert had silver hair, receding from a forehead lined with years of sun and worry. His shoulders were still broad, but carried differently now, with the careful posture of someone who had learned to protect a back that protested too much activity. His eyes, though, his eyes were exactly the same. Deep brown with flecks of gold, capable of seeing straight through to my soul. "My God," he said, his voice rougher than I remembered, weathered like the rest of him. "You look exactly the same." I laughed, a sound that came out more nervous than I intended. You always were a terrible liar. But as he moved around the table to embrace me, a careful, respectful hug that lasted exactly the appropriate amount of time and yet felt like coming home, I caught a whiff of his cologne, and suddenly I was 18 again, dancing at the senior prom, believing that love could last forever if you just wanted it badly enough. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "I got lost twice getting here. GPS and I don't get along very well." Technology, I agreed, though I had mastered my smartphone years ago out of necessity. My grandchildren would accept nothing less than FaceTime calls and text messages filled with emojis I was still learning to interpret. The waitress approached, and Robert ordered a beer, the same brand he had preferred in high school, which made me smile. Some things, apparently, never changed. We studied our menus in the kind of awkward silence that falls between people who once knew each other's every thought, but now had decades of unknown territory to navigate. "So," he said, finally, setting down his menu and looking directly at me, 43 years. 43 years, I echoed, not trusting myself to say more. "I heard about David. I'm sorry, Maggie. I really am." The sincere condolence threatened to undo me. I had grown skilled at accepting sympathy from acquaintances and even close friends, but hearing it from Robert felt different. He had known me before I became David's wife, before I became anyone's mother. He was sorry for my loss, yes, but also acknowledging the end of the life I had built after he left. "Thank you," I managed. "It was unexpected. Heart attack. He was gardening, doing something he loved." "That's a blessing in a way." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I agreed. David's sudden death had left me spinning, unprepared for widowhood, unsure how to be myself without being half of a couple. A longer illness might have been kinder in some ways, allowing time for preparation, for final conversations, for gradual letting go. "What about you?" I asked. "I heard you married. Children?" His expression shifted, something guarded moving across his features. "Divorced. Twice, actually. No children." The admission hung between us, heavy with implications I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. Robert, who had left me to find himself, had apparently found heartbreak instead. Or perhaps he had found exactly what he was looking for, and it hadn't been enough to sustain him through the decades that followed. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "Don't be. Some of us aren't cut out for forever, I guess." But I remembered a 22-year-old boy who had talked about forever with such conviction that I had believed him completely. I remembered late-night conversations about the house we would buy, the children we would have, the way we would grow old together. What had changed between that boy's dreams and this man's reality? The waitress returned, and we ordered our meals. Salmon for me, steak for him. Choices that felt both adult and safe. As we waited for our food, Robert told me about his life in California, his career in real estate that had taken him from modest success to near bankruptcy and back again. He spoke of surfing lessons in his 50s, of hiking trails that challenged his aging knees, of a lifestyle that sounded exciting and lonely in equal measure. I found myself sharing more than I had intended, stories about my children's achievements and struggles, about the book club I had joined after David's death, about learning to manage finances and home repairs, and all the things that had been David's domain. I told him about my volunteer work at the Literacy Center, about teaching adults to read, and discovering that learning never stops, no matter how old you get. "You were always good with people," he said, and I was surprised by how much his approval still meant to me. Our food arrived, providing a welcome distraction from the weight of memory and revelation. We ate in more comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on the quality of the meal or the service. It was easier to focus on the present moment, on the simple pleasure of good food and company, than to navigate the minefield of our shared past. "Do you remember," Robert said suddenly, his fork poised halfway to his mouth, "that time we drove to the lake at midnight because you wanted to see the meteor shower?" I did remember. We had been 19, fearless and completely in love. We had spread a blanket on the hood of his beat-up Chevy and spent hours watching the sky, making wishes on falling stars, and planning our future with the certainty that only very young people possess. "You fell asleep on my shoulder," I said. "I was afraid to move because I didn't want to wake you." "I wasn't really asleep. I was just listening to your breathing, trying to memorize it." The admission caught me off guard. It was too intimate, too raw for this careful dance we had been performing. "Robert," I began, but he held up his hand. "I know, too much, too soon. I'm sorry." But the moment had shifted something between us. The polite strangers we had been pretending to be fell away, revealing the deeper connection that had never really died, only gone dormant. "Why did you really leave?" I asked, the question I had carried for 43 years finally finding its voice. He set down his fork and looked at me with an expression so full of regret that I almost regretted asking. "I was scared," he said simply. "I was 22 years old, and I loved you so much it terrified me. My parents had the worst marriage you can imagine. Screaming fights, throwing things, making each other miserable for 30 years. I was convinced that love always turned into that eventually. I thought if I left before it happened to us, I could preserve what we had." "But you didn't preserve it," I said quietly. "You destroyed it." "I know that now, but at 22, it seemed like the noble thing to do. Protect you from the mess I was sure I would become." I absorbed this, trying to reconcile the boy I had loved with the man sitting across from me. Young Robert had been impulsive, passionate, given to grand gestures and dramatic declarations. This older Robert seemed measured, careful with his words, in a way that suggested he had learned the weight they could carry. "Did you ever wonder what would have happened if you had stayed?" I asked. "Every day for the first 10 years. Then I tried to stop thinking about it because it was driving me crazy." I understood. I had done my own share of wondering, especially in the early years of my marriage to David, when everything was new and different, and I was still learning how to love someone who wasn't Robert. David had been patient with my ghosts, secure enough in our growing love to let me heal at my own pace. "I loved David," I said, needing Robert to understand this. "Our marriage was good, happy, real." "I'm glad," he said, and I could see that he meant it. "You deserved happiness, Maggie. You deserved everything good." The past tense stung. Deserved. As if my capacity for happiness had ended with David's death. As if at 64 I was too old for new beginnings or second chances. "What about now?" I asked, surprising myself with my boldness. "What do I deserve now?" He studied my face as if trying to read an answer there. "I don't know. What do you want?" It was a question I had been asking myself for 3 years, ever since David's funeral, ever since the sympathy cards stopped coming and the casserole stopped appearing on my doorstep, and I was left alone with the silence of a house that had once been full of life and love and the daily routines of marriage. What did I want? I wanted to feel alive again. I wanted to wake up in the morning with something to look forward to besides another day of careful solitude. I wanted to feel desirable, valuable, worth pursuing. I wanted to stop being brave all the time and let someone else be strong for a while. But I couldn't say any of that to Robert. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I want to not feel like an afterthought," I said instead. "I want to not be invisible." He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His skin was spotted with age, his knuckles slightly swollen with arthritis, but his touch was warm and familiar and sent a shock of recognition through my entire body. You could never be invisible, Maggie, not to me. I looked down at our joined hands, his larger and rougher, mine soft from years of hand cream and careful maintenance. We weren't young anymore. We weren't the smooth-skinned, hopeful couple who had planned a life together under a canopy of stars. We were scarred and careful and carrying the weight of decades of choices and compromises and losses. But there was something between us still, something that had survived 43 years of silence and separation, something that made my heart race like a teenager's and my palms sweat like a woman on her first date. I don't know how to do this, I admitted.
What? Any of this? I don't know how to be anything other than David's widow. I don't know how to start over at 64. I don't know how to trust that this isn't just nostalgia or loneliness or some kind of midlife crisis that's running about 20 years late. Robert squeezed my hand gently. Maybe we don't have to figure it all out tonight. Maybe we can just have dinner and see what happens next. It sounded so simple when he said it, so reasonable. But I knew that nothing about this was simple, and I was old enough to understand that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. We finished our meal in a different kind of silence, one charged with possibility, and waited with the knowledge that we were standing at a crossroads neither of us had expected to encounter. When the check came, Robert insisted on paying, and I let him, understanding that some gestures were about more than money. "Would you like to take a walk?" he asked as we left the restaurant. "There's a park across the street, unless you need to get home." I thought about my empty house, about the book I had been reading, about the evening news I usually watched while eating a solitary dinner. None of it seemed urgent or important compared to the possibility of extending this evening, this return to a version of myself I had thought was lost forever. "A walk would be nice," I said. The park was small but well-maintained, with winding paths lit by old-fashioned lampposts that cast everything in a warm, golden glow. We walked slowly, conscious of our aging joints and the uneven pavement, but also reluctant to rush through whatever this was. "I used to bring my grandchildren here," I said, as we passed a playground where a few children were enjoying the last light of day under their parents' watchful eyes. Back when they were small enough to think spending time with Grandma was fun. "How old are they now?" 16 and 14.
Too cool for grandparents, except when they need money or rides to places their parents won't take them. Robert laughed. "Sounds about right. I missed all that, the grandparent thing. Sometimes I wonder if that was a mistake, too." "Children aren't guarantees of anything," I said, thinking of my own complicated relationships with my adult children. Love them as much as you can, and they still make their own choices, their own mistakes. Sometimes they surprise you, sometimes they break your heart. Do you regret having them? Never, but I regret some of the things I did as their mother. I was so focused on being perfect, on doing everything right, that I forgot to just enjoy them sometimes. We found a bench near a small pond where ducks paddled lazily in the fading light. Robert sat down heavily, and I heard him wince slightly as his knees bent. "Getting old is not for the weak," he said, echoing my own thoughts. David used to say that aging was better than the alternative. Smart man. He was, kind too, patient with my moods, understanding about my past. He never made me feel guilty about having loved someone before him. I wasn't sure why I was telling Robert this, except that it felt important for him to understand that I hadn't spent 43 years pining for what we had lost. I had built a good life, a full life, a life worth living. "I'm glad," Robert said quietly. "I hated the thought that I had ruined love for you." "You didn't ruin it. You changed it, made me more careful maybe, more appreciative when I found it again." A comfortable silence settled over us as we watched the ducks and the last of the evening joggers making their circuits around the park. I found myself studying Robert's profile in the lamplight, trying to reconcile the young man I had loved with the older man beside me.
What happens now? I asked eventually. I don't know. What do you want to happen? It was the second time he had asked me what I wanted, and I was beginning to understand that this was his way of giving me control over a situation that felt largely beyond anyone's control. I want to see you again, I said, the admission coming out in a rush before I could change my mind. I'd like that too. But I also want to go slow. I want to figure out who we are now, not who we were 43 years ago. That makes sense. And I want to be honest about everything, about David, about my life, about what I can and can't offer at this stage of my life. I want that too, Maggie. Honesty, no games, no pretending to be someone we're not. I turned to look at him directly. Who are you now, Robert? Really? He considered the question seriously. I'm a man who made some spectacular mistakes and learned from most of them. I'm someone who's finally figured out that being alone isn't the same thing as being independent. I'm old enough to know that time is precious and too short to waste on anything that doesn't matter. And do I matter? You've always mattered. That's why I'm here. The simple statement undid me completely. After 3 years of feeling invisible, of wondering if anyone would ever see me as more than a widow or a grandmother or a woman of a certain age, here was someone telling me that I mattered, that I had always mattered. I felt tears threatening and looked away, embarrassed by the intensity of my reaction. "Hey," Robert said softly, and I felt his fingers gently turn my face back toward his. "It's okay." "I'm not used to this," I whispered, feeling like this. I thought I was done with all of it. The butterflies, the uncertainty, the hope. Maybe we're never really done with hope. He leaned closer, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me. Part of me wanted him to, wanted to close the circle that had been broken so long ago. But instead, he simply touched his forehead to mine, a gesture so tender and careful that it took my breath away. "I should probably go," I said, though I made no move to leave. "Probably," he agreed, not moving either. We sat like that for several more minutes, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, existing in a bubble of possibility that felt both fragile and precious. Finally, I pulled back. "Will you walk me to my car?" "Of course." We made our way slowly back through the park, neither of us speaking. At my car, Robert waited while I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking slightly from emotion and the evening's revelations. "Maggie," he said as I opened the driver's door. "Yes?" "Thank you for taking a chance, for saying yes to dinner, for giving us this opportunity to find out what we might be now." I studied his face in the parking lot's harsh fluorescent light. He looked older here, more worn, but also somehow more real than he had in the restaurant's flattering ambiance. "I'm scared," I admitted. "Me too, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe being scared means it matters." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He stepped closer and kissed my cheek, a gentle gesture that somehow felt more intimate than anything that had passed between us all evening. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said, "if that's okay." "That's okay." I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying every moment of the evening. My house felt different when I walked in. Not empty, exactly, but expectant, as if it were waiting to see what I would become next. I went through my evening routine mechanically, changing clothes, washing my face, brushing my teeth, but I felt anything but routine. I felt alive in a way I hadn't experienced in years, buzzing with possibility and terror in equal measure. As I lay in bed that night, David's side still instinctively left empty beside me, I thought about the strange circling of time, the way life sometimes offered unexpected second acts to those brave enough to accept them. I thought about Robert's aged hands covering mine, about the way he said my name like a prayer, about the boy he had been and the man he had become. I thought about hope and how it felt both dangerous and necessary, like oxygen to someone who had been holding her breath for 3 years without even realizing it.
Tomorrow, Robert would call, and I would have to decide whether to take another step into this uncertain territory or retreat to the safety of my carefully constructed solitude. But tonight, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I fell asleep smiling. The phone rang at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning, just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee and wondering if I had imagined the entire previous evening. But Robert's voice, warm and slightly nervous, confirmed that it had been real. "Good morning, Maggie. Did you sleep well?" "Eventually," I said, surprised by my own honesty. I kept thinking about everything we talked about. "Me too. I was wondering if you might like to do something today. Nothing fancy. Maybe drive out to Miller's Lake? If you're free, that is." Miller's Lake, the scene of countless teenage dates, summer picnics, and that midnight meteor shower that had become part of our shared mythology. It was either the perfect suggestion or the worst possible one, depending on how willing I was to walk directly into the heart of our shared history. "I'd like that," I heard myself saying. We arranged to meet at noon, and I spent the intervening hours in a state of nervous preparation that reminded me uncomfortably of being 16 again. I changed clothes 3 times before settling on khakis and a blue sweater that brought out my eyes, a fact David had mentioned countless times, and one I hoped Robert might notice as well. Sarah called just as I was touching up my lipstick. "How did last night go?" she asked without preamble. My daughter had inherited my directness along with my stubborn streak. "It went well," I said carefully. "Well, that's it? Mom, you had dinner with your high school boyfriend after 43 years, and all you can say is that it went well?" "It was complicated, Sarah. Good, but complicated." I could hear her sigh through the phone. "Are you seeing him again?" "We're going to Miller's Lake this afternoon." "Miller's Lake? Mom, that's where you and Dad used to take us for picnics when we were kids? Isn't that where you and Robert—" "Yes," I interrupted. "It's where Robert and I used to go when we were young." Another sigh. "Just be careful, okay? I know you're lonely, and I know Dad's been gone for 3 years, but this man broke your heart once. What's to say he won't do it again?" It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself since Robert had first contacted me 6 weeks ago through a mutual friend from high school. What was to say that this wasn't just a nostalgic whim that would fade as quickly as it had appeared? What was to say that 2 people in their 60s could bridge 4 decades of separate lives and different choices? I don't have any guarantees, Sarah, but I don't think I want to live the rest of my life being afraid of getting hurt again. "That's what scares me," she said softly. "You've been so strong since Dad died. I don't want to see you broken." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring out at the garden David had loved so much. The roses he had planted were blooming despite my indifferent care, pink and white and deep red blossoms that filled the air with sweetness. I wondered what David would think about Robert's return to my life. He had been secure enough in our marriage that he had never been threatened by my past, but he had also been alive then, present, a daily reminder that love could be comfortable and steady and real. Now there was only memory and an empty house and the risky proposition of starting over at an age when most people were thinking about winding down rather than beginning again. Robert was waiting for me in the lake's parking lot, leaning against a silver sedan that looked like the kind of sensible car a man of his age should drive. He was wearing jeans and a polo shirt, an outfit that managed to be both casual and carefully chosen. When he saw me, his face broke into a smile that made him look years younger. "You look beautiful," he said as I got out of my car, and I felt that familiar flutter in my chest. "Thank you. You look pretty good yourself." We had agreed to take his car, and as we drove the winding road around the lake, he filled me in on what had changed since my last visit years ago. New housing developments had sprung up along the far shore, and there was a marina now where speedboats and pontoon boats bobbed in neat rows. But the spot where we had always parked,
A small clearing with a view of the water and the distant mountains remained unchanged. "Some things stay the same," Robert said as he spread a blanket he had brought from his car. "Some things," I agreed, settling beside him on the blanket with a care that hadn't been necessary 40 years ago. My knees protested the unfamiliar position, and I made a mental note to start doing more yoga. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the water lap against the shore and the sailboats dotting the lake's surface like elegant white birds. A family with young children had claimed the beach area, and their laughter carried across the water, mixing with the cries of seagulls and the distant hum of motorboats. "Do you come here often?" I asked. "This is my first time back in probably 15 years. He paused, searching for the right word. "Loaded with memory?" "Exactly. But it's not as hard as I thought it would be, maybe because you're here with me this time." I understood what he meant. The lake held dozens of memories of our younger selves, passionate kisses in the backseat of his car, long conversations about our future, promises we had been too young to understand the weight of. But having the older Robert beside me somehow made it possible to appreciate those memories without being overwhelmed by them. "Tell me about your marriages," I said, the question emerging from some brave part of me that needed to understand what had happened to him in the years after he left. Robert was quiet for so long that I began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "The first one was a disaster from the beginning. I married Linda because she was everything you weren't: blonde, sophisticated, uninterested in commitment or emotional intimacy. I think I thought that would protect me from getting hurt again. Did it work? For a while. We lasted 7 years, but we were essentially strangers living in the same house. The divorce was a relief for both of us. And the second? Jennifer was different. Kind, intelligent, patient with my emotional unavailability. She deserved better than what I could give her, and she finally figured that out after 12 years. What couldn't you give her?" He turned to look at me directly. My whole heart. Part of it was always somewhere else. The admission hung between us, too significant to acknowledge directly, and too important to ignore. I felt the weight of it, the responsibility of knowing that I had shaped his capacity for love in ways that had affected 2 other women, 2 other lives. "That's not fair to me," I said quietly, "or to them, or to you. I know." But knowing it and being able to change it turned out to be 2 different things. And now? Now I'm old enough to understand that carrying a torch for someone isn't the same thing as loving them. It took me until my 50s to figure out the difference between nostalgia and genuine emotion. I absorbed this, trying to understand what it meant for us now. Was he saying that what he had felt for me all these years had been mere nostalgia? Or was he saying that he was finally capable of something more real and present? "What about you?" he asked. "Were you happy with David?" It was my turn to consider my words carefully. The truth was complicated, layered with the kind of nuanced emotion that develops over decades of shared life. Yes, I was happy. Not the breathless, desperate kind of happiness I thought love should be when I was young. Something steadier, more sustainable. "Did you ever think about me?" In the beginning, yes, especially during the hard times, when the children were small and David was working long hours and I felt overwhelmed and alone. I would remember being 18 and thinking that love was supposed to solve everything. But it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Love is work, daily choice, compromise and patience and forgiveness. The butterflies are wonderful, but they don't last through sleepless nights with sick children or arguments about money or the gradual wearing away of physical passion. Robert was quiet, absorbing this. "It sounds like you learned something I never did." "I learned it because I had to, because David was a good man who deserved my full attention, and because our children deserved parents who were completely present for them. Do you think I can learn it now, at 65? The question surprised me with its vulnerability. This was not the confident young man who had broken my heart by leaving to find himself. This was someone who had found himself, finally, and discovered that some of what he found wasn't very admirable. I think people can change at any age, I said, but I think they have to want to change, and they have to be willing to do the work. I want to try, Maggie, with you, if you're willing. There it was, the proposition I had been both hoping for and dreading. Robert wasn't just asking me to revisit our past. He was asking me to help him build a future neither of us could predict or control. A pontoon boat full of teenagers cruised by, music blaring from speakers, the kids laughing and posing for selfies. They looked so young, so certain that the world was full of endless possibility. I remembered feeling that way once, before I learned about disappointment and loss and the way time changes everything, whether you want it to or not. I'm willing to try, I said, finally, but I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was at 21. I'm not going to wait around wondering if you're going to stay this time. I'm not going to put my life on hold while you figure out what you want. I wouldn't ask you to. And I need you to understand that David will always be part of who I am. I won't apologize for the life I built with him or pretend it didn't happen. I don't want you to. And if this doesn't work out, if we discover that we're better as a memory than as a reality, I need us to be able to walk away with our dignity intact. No drama, no recriminations, no trying to punish each other for being human. Robert reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. Can I tell you something? I nodded. Sitting here with you, having this conversation, I feel more hopeful than I have in years. Not because I think we can recapture what we had when we were young, but because I think we might be able to create something new, something better. What would that look like? I don't know, maybe dinner twice a week? Maybe weekend trips to places we've never been. Maybe growing old together without the pressure of having to be everything to each other. It sounded reasonable, adult, the kind of relationship two people our age could build based on genuine affection rather than desperate need. I'd like that, I said. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, we packed up our blanket and walked slowly back to the car. I felt different than I had that morning, not transformed exactly, but somehow more fully myself, as if talking honestly about what we wanted and didn't want had cleared the air of unrealistic expectations and allowed something more authentic to emerge. That evening, Robert took me to dinner at a small Italian restaurant that neither of us had been to before. It felt important to choose neutral territory, someplace that belonged to this new version of us rather than to our shared past or our separate histories. Over linguine and a bottle of Chianti, we talked about practical things, his plans to sell his house in California and relocate closer to his elderly mother, my involvement with the literacy program, the books we were reading, the movies we had enjoyed. It was the kind of conversation two adults have when they're genuinely interested in each other's lives rather than just trying to recapture lost youth. I have a confession, Robert said as we shared tiramisu for dessert. Oh no, what now? When I first contacted you, I thought maybe we could just pick up where we left off, pretend that the last 43 years hadn't happened. And now? Now I realized that would be a terrible mistake. Those 43 years made us who we are. Without them, we'd still be those kids who were too young and scared to know what real love looks like. I set down my fork, studying his face in the restaurant's candlelight. What does real love look like to you now? Patience, acceptance. The ability to let someone be themselves without trying to change them. He paused, swirling the wine in his glass. The courage to be vulnerable without expecting the other person to fix all your broken places.
It was a beautiful answer, and one that told me he had done real work on himself during those years of failed marriages and emotional unavailability. But I had learned to be cautious about beautiful answers. David had taught me that actions mattered more than words. "Those are lovely sentiments," I said, "but how do I know you won't wake up in 6 months and decide you need to find yourself again?" The question hit its mark. I could see Robert flinch slightly, and I felt both guilty for the barb and proud of myself for asking it. "You don't know," he said simply, "and I don't know that you won't decide I'm too much work or too set in my ways or not worth the risk. We're both taking a chance here, Maggie." He was right, of course. At our age, there were no guarantees about anything, not health, not time, not the ability to change patterns that had been decades in the making. We were both walking into this with our eyes open and our hearts scarred by previous losses. "I suppose we are," I said. After dinner, we walked through downtown, window shopping and talking about the changes the city had undergone since our youth. Many of the stores we remembered were gone, replaced by trendy boutiques and upscale restaurants that catered to a younger, more affluent demographic. But the movie theater where we had held hands during Saturday matinees was still there, albeit with multiple screens and stadium seating instead of the single screen and worn velvet seats of our memories. "Want to see what's playing?" Robert asked. I checked my watch. It was only 8:30, and I realized I wasn't ready for the evening to end. Why not? We chose a romantic comedy that looked harmless enough, the kind of movie where attractive people in their 30s navigated the complications of modern dating with wit and charm and ultimately found their happy ending. As we settled into our seats with overpriced popcorn and sodas, I felt like a teenager again, hyper-aware of Robert's presence beside me in the darkened theater. But the movie, it turned out, was more poignant than I had expected. The female protagonist was a widow learning to date again, and her struggles with guilt and uncertainty hit closer to home than I was prepared for. When she had her first post-husband kiss and immediately burst into tears, I felt my own eyes fill. Robert must have noticed my reaction because he reached over and squeezed my hand. The simple gesture of comfort undid me completely, and I found myself crying silently in the darkness, overwhelmed by the complexity of my own emotions. "Do you want to leave?" Robert whispered. I shook my head, not trusting my voice. We sat through the rest of the movie with his hand covering mine, his thumb occasionally stroking across my knuckles in a gesture so gentle it made me want to cry all over again. In the lobby afterward, Robert handed me tissues from his pocket without comment. I dabbed at my eyes, grateful that my waterproof mascara had lived up to its promises. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't expect that to hit me so hard." "Don't apologize. It's a lot to process, all of this." We walked to our cars in thoughtful silence. At my driver's door, Robert stopped and turned to face me. "Maggie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." My heart rate picked up. "Okay, are you doing this because you want to, or because you're lonely and I'm a familiar face?" The question was so direct, so cutting to the heart of my own uncertainties that I almost laughed. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe both." Does that make me a terrible person? It makes you human. I'm lonely too, Maggie, and scared, and not entirely sure what I'm doing here, except that being with you feels right in a way nothing has felt right in a very long time. I looked at him standing there under the parking lot lights, this man who had been both my greatest love and my deepest heartbreak, now offering me something I wasn't sure I was brave enough to accept. What are we doing, Robert? I think we're trying to figure out if two people can have a second chance without making the same mistakes they made the first time. And if we can't, then we'll have tried. And maybe that's enough. He stepped closer, and this time I didn't step back.
When he cupped my face in his hands and kissed me, it felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff all at once. His lips were familiar, but different, gentler than I remembered, more careful. It was the kiss of a man who had learned the value of tenderness, and it left me breathless. I should go, I whispered against his mouth. You should, he agreed, but neither of us moved. We stood there in the parking lot, foreheads touching, breathing each other's air, until a group of teenagers walked by and reminded us that we were not, in fact, alone in the world. Tomorrow? Robert asked as I finally got into my car. Tomorrow. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of dinners and long walks, afternoon drives and quiet conversations over coffee. We fell into a routine that felt both natural and carefully constructed, seeing each other 3 or 4 times a week, talking on the phone every evening, slowly building something that was neither the passionate romance of our youth nor the comfortable companionship of long marriage, but something entirely new. Robert was attentive without being overwhelming, romantic without being presumptuous. He brought me flowers, not roses, which would have been too loaded with symbolism, but cheerful mixed bouquets that brightened my kitchen table. He listened when I talked about my children's lives and my concerns about aging parents. He shared stories about his work, his travels, his gradual recognition that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. We were careful with each other, polite in the way of people who understand that at our age, there might not be time to recover from major mistakes. But underneath the careful courtesy, I could feel the pull of deeper emotion, the gradual lowering of walls that had taken decades to construct. My children, predictably, were divided in their reactions. Sarah remained skeptical, convinced that I was setting myself up for another heartbreak. My son Michael was cautiously supportive, happy to see me more animated than I had been since David's death. My youngest, Jennifer, who had inherited David's practical nature, peppered me with questions about Robert's finances, his health insurance, his long-term plans. "I'm not marrying him, Jen," I said during one particularly intense phone conversation. "We're just spending time together. For now. But Mom, you're not 20 anymore. If this gets serious, you need to think about practical things. What happens if one of you gets sick? What about your house, your assets? What if he moves back to California?" These were all reasonable concerns, and ones I had been trying not to think about. At 64, dating wasn't just about companionship and romance. It was about potentially blending entire lives that had been built separately over decades. It was about children and grandchildren and Social Security benefits and Medicare supplements and all the unglamorous realities that young love never had to consider. But there were moments when all the practical concerns seemed less important than the simple joy of having someone to share the small pleasures of daily life. When Robert called to tell me about a funny encounter at the grocery store, or when we discovered a shared love of old movies and spent an entire Saturday afternoon watching Casablanca and Roman Holiday, or when he held my hand during a particularly emotional scene in a play we attended together, I felt like I was remembering how to be happy. The first time he stayed for dinner at my house, I was as nervous as I had been for our first restaurant meal. I cooked David's favorite pot roast, then worried that it was somehow disrespectful to serve another man a meal that had been part of my marriage routine. But Robert ate with obvious pleasure, complimented my cooking without overdoing it, and helped with the dishes afterward as if it were the most natural thing in the world. After dinner, we sat in the living room with coffee and brandy, and I found myself really looking at him in the familiar surroundings of my home. He seemed to fit there, settled into David's old chair as if he belonged. But he also seemed aware of the significance of the space, careful not to touch David's books or move things without asking. "This is a beautiful room," he said, looking around at the family photos and the artwork David and I had collected over the years. David had good taste, better than mine anyway. "I can see you in it too, though. The colors, the way everything's arranged, it feels like you." It was a generous thing to say, and I appreciated his ability to acknowledge David's presence without being threatened by it. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." "Do you ever feel guilty about being here with me after all this time?" Robert considered the question seriously. Not guilty, exactly, but aware of the weight of it, the choices that led us here, the people who might have been hurt along the way. Your ex-wives? Your husband, my ex-wives, the versions of ourselves we had to become in order to get to this point. I understood what he meant. We weren't the same people who had fallen in love at 17. We were shaped by marriages that had ended, by children raised and grandchildren cherished, by losses that had changed us in fundamental ways. In some sense, Robert and Maggie were meeting for the first time, even though our younger selves shared a history. "Do you think they would approve?" I asked, "the people who loved us before?" "I think David would want you to be happy, and I think Linda and Jennifer knew they were getting only part of me, even if they didn't understand why." That night, as Robert prepared to leave, there was a moment of awkwardness at the door. We had been building toward deeper intimacy for weeks, but neither of us had pushed beyond gentle kisses and careful touches. At our age, physical intimacy carried different meanings and different risks than it had when we were young. "Maggie," Robert said, his hand on the door handle. "Yes?" "I want you to know that I'm not in any hurry. Whatever happens between us physically, I want it to happen when you're ready, when we're both sure." The consideration in his voice touched me deeply. After 3 years of celibacy, of sleeping alone in a bed that had once been shared, the prospect of physical intimacy was both thrilling and terrifying. My body was 64 years old, marked by childbirth and age and the gradual softening that time brings to everyone. The idea of being naked with someone new, vulnerable in ways I hadn't been since my early 20s, filled me with anxiety. "Thank you," I said. "That means more to me than you know." He kissed me goodnight, a gentle kiss that somehow managed to be both chaste and full of promise. After he left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, thinking about desire and fear and the unexpected complexity of starting over at an age when most people assumed such things were behind them. I thought about David, who had loved my body through all its changes, who had made me feel beautiful even when I felt anything but. I wondered if it was possible to feel that kind of acceptance again, or if the self-consciousness of age would always stand in the way. But more than that, I wondered if I was ready to risk the kind of vulnerability that real intimacy required. Not just physical vulnerability, but emotional openness that could leave me devastated if Robert decided, once again, that he needed something else. The decision, when it came, was made not in a moment of passion, but in an afternoon of quiet companionship. Robert had come over to help me plant bulbs for spring, a task that would have been simple 10 years earlier, but now required careful attention to our aging joints and limited stamina. We worked in comfortable silence, our hands occasionally brushing as we reached for the same tools. When we finished, we sat on my back steps, sharing a beer and admiring our work. "The tulips should be beautiful next spring," Robert said. "If we did it right. I've never been much of a gardener. That was David's territory." "I think you're selling yourself short. You have good instincts." I looked at him sitting beside me, his hair mussed from the afternoon's work, a smudge of dirt on his cheek that he hadn't noticed. He looked settled, content, as if he belonged in this garden, in this life I had built. "Robert," I said, my heart racing with the decision I was about to make. "Yes? Would you like to stay for dinner? And maybe stay the night?" He turned to look at me, his expression serious and tender. "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm sure I want to try." He reached over and took my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "I want that too, more than you know." We went inside together, suddenly shy with each other in a way we hadn't been in weeks. I busied myself making dinner while Robert opened a bottle of wine, both of us aware that we had crossed some invisible line and were now in uncharted territory.
Over dinner, we talked about everything except what was going to happen afterward. We discussed the news, our plans for the weekend, a book Robert was reading. But underneath the ordinary conversation, there was an electric awareness, a sense of anticipation that made every casual touch feel significant. After we cleaned up the dishes, we sat in the living room with our wine, the silence stretching between us until it became almost unbearable. "I'm nervous," I admitted finally. "Me too. It's been a long time since I was with anyone besides David. It's been a long time since I was with someone I cared about this much." The admission hung between us, honest and vulnerable. I looked at this man who had been both my first love and my greatest regret, now offering himself to me with a gentleness I hadn't expected. "I don't know what I'm doing," I said. "Neither do I. But maybe that's okay." When he stood and extended his hand to me, I took it without hesitation. We walked upstairs together, past the family photos lining the stairwell, past the bedroom where David and I had shared 37 years of marriage, to the guest room that felt neutral, safe, like territory that belonged to neither my past nor my uncertain future. What happened next was tender and careful, and nothing like the passionate encounters of our youth. We undressed slowly, shyly, learning each other's aging bodies with the reverence due to sacred things. Robert traced the silver stretch marks on my belly where I had carried our children, not his children, but children that existed because he had left and I had found love elsewhere. I mapped the scars on his chest from a heart surgery he told me about in whispered explanations between kisses. We were not beautiful in the way young lovers are beautiful. But there was something deeper in our careful exploration of each other, something that spoke to the preciousness of time and the courage required to risk intimacy when you understand how easily it can be lost. When we finally came together, it was with the knowledge that this might be our last chance at this kind of connection, that bodies like ours were not guaranteed many more opportunities for such tenderness. The urgency that knowledge brought made every touch more meaningful, every whispered endearment more precious. Afterward, we lay in the darkness, talking quietly about nothing important, the sounds of the house settling, the way the moonlight fell across the floor, the surprising comfort of being held again after years of sleeping alone. "Are you okay?" Robert asked as I settled against his shoulder. "More than okay," I said, and realized it was true. "You?" "Perfect," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Absolutely perfect." I fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, feeling safer and more complete than I had since David's death. When I woke in the morning, Robert was already up, dressed, sitting in the chair by the window reading. "Good morning," he softly, closing his book and coming to sit on the edge of the bed. "Good morning. You're up early." "Old habits. I've been watching you sleep, trying to convince myself this is real." I stretched, suddenly self-conscious in the morning light. "It's real." He leaned down and kissed me, a gentle kiss that tasted like coffee and possibility. "I made breakfast," he said, "if you're hungry." We ate on the back patio, surrounded by the bulbs we had planted the day before. Everything looked different in the morning light, brighter, more hopeful. I felt different too, as if something that had been locked away for years had finally been freed. "What happens now?" I asked as we finished our coffee. "I don't know." "What do you want to happen?" It was becoming our standard question, this checking in with each other about desires and boundaries and expectations. I appreciated Robert's refusal to make assumptions, even as part of me wished he would sometimes just decide things for both of us. "I want to see where this goes," I said, without rushing, without making promises we might not be able to keep, but also without being so careful that we miss the good parts. "That sounds perfect to me." As Robert prepared to leave for his hotel, we made plans for the following day. Dinner and a movie, ordinary and comfortable and real. The kind of plans that couples make when they're building something sustainable rather than just chasing excitement. After he left, I walked through my house, seeing it with new eyes. For 3 years, it had been a monument to loss, filled with memories of the life David and I had shared. But this morning, it felt like a home again, a place where new memories could be made alongside the old ones. I called Sarah, needing to share my happiness with someone, even though I knew she would have concerns. "Mom," she said, answering on the second ring, "is everything okay? You sound different." "I'm happy, Sarah, really happy." There was a pause. "This is about Robert, isn't it?" "Yes." "Mom, please be careful. I know you care about him, but—" "Sarah," I interrupted gently, "I'm 64 years old. I've raised 3 children, buried my husband, survived cancer, learned to manage money and fix leaky faucets, and all the things women of my generation weren't supposed to have to know how to do. I think I can handle a relationship." "I know you can. I just don't want you to get hurt." "Sweetheart, I'm going to get hurt. We all are, eventually. That's what happens when you love people. But hiding from love doesn't protect you from pain. It just guarantees you'll miss the joy." After we hung up, I sat in David's garden, my garden now, thinking about joy and pain and the strange courage it takes to keep opening your heart even when you know how much it can cost. I thought about Robert sleeping alone in his hotel room, about the decades of loneliness that had brought us both to this unexpected second chance. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went shopping for new clothes. Not practical clothes for gardening or volunteer work, but beautiful things that made me feel attractive and feminine. I bought a dress in a shade of blue that brought out my eyes, lingerie that made me feel like a woman rather than just someone's mother or grandmother, a perfume that smelled like hope. I was learning to be myself again, not just the careful, grieving widow I had become, but the whole woman I had always been underneath. It was terrifying and exhilarating, this process of rediscovering parts of myself I had thought were lost forever. When Robert picked me up for dinner that evening, I was wearing the new dress. The appreciation in his eyes made me feel beautiful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. "You look stunning," he said, and I believed him. "I feel good," I said, "better than I have in a long time." That night, he stayed again, and the night after that. Without any formal discussion or decision, we began spending most evenings together, alternating between my house and his hotel room until it became clear that the arrangement was both impractical and unnecessary. "I've been thinking," Robert said one morning as we shared breakfast on my patio, "about selling my place in California and finding something here, if that's something you'd be okay with." My heart raced. This was what I had been both hoping for and fearing, the moment when our careful courtship became something more permanent and serious. "Are you sure? That's a big decision." "I'm sure about you, Maggie. I'm sure about us." "And I'm tired of living in hotel rooms and rental cars." "What would you do here? For work, I mean." "I have enough saved to retire comfortably. I thought maybe I'd do some volunteer work, spend time with you, figure out what the next chapter looks like." It sounded wonderful and terrifying in equal measure, having Robert nearby all the time, having to integrate him into my established routines and relationships, having to make room in my carefully ordered life for someone else's needs and preferences. But more than that, it sounded like happiness, like the possibility of growing old with someone who knew both who I had been and who I was becoming. "I'd like that," I said, "but I want to take it slow. Maybe you could find a small apartment first, somewhere close by. We can see how it goes." That makes perfect sense. Over the following weeks, Robert began the process of untangling his life in California. He put his house on the market, arranged for movers, said goodbye to the few friends he had maintained there. It was strange to watch him dismantle a life I had never been part of, to see him choose me over the familiar patterns he had established over decades. My children gradually began to accept that Robert was going to be a permanent part of my life. Sarah remained cautious,
but stopped actively discouraging the relationship. Michael invited Robert to play golf, a gesture of acceptance that meant more to me than any words could have. Jennifer grilled him about his long-term care insurance and seemed satisfied with his answers. The first time I introduced Robert to my grandchildren, I was nervous in a way I hadn't expected. These children were David's legacy as much as mine, and I worried they would see Robert as a betrayal of their grandfather's memory. But children, it turns out, are remarkably adaptable when the adults in their lives are happy. My 16-year-old grandson shook Robert's hand with the grave formality of young men trying to be grown up. My 14-year-old granddaughter, after an initial period of shy observation, pronounced Robert actually pretty cool for an old guy. "He makes Grandma smile again," she told her mother later, "like she did before Grandpa died." It was exactly the right thing to say and exactly what I needed to hear. I wasn't replacing David or dishonoring his memory by loving someone else. I was simply refusing to let grief define the rest of my life. By Christmas, Robert had found a small apartment 3 miles from my house, close enough for daily visits, but separate enough to maintain some independence. We spent the holidays together, blending his traditions with mine, creating new rituals that belong to this unexpected phase of our lives. On New Year's Eve, we went to a party at the community center, surrounded by other couples our age who had found love again after loss or divorce. We danced to songs from the 50s and 60s, holding each other carefully, mindful of our limitations, but grateful for the music and the movement and the simple pleasure of being together. As midnight approached, Robert took my hand and led me outside to the small garden behind the center. "I have something to tell you," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. My heart clenched. After months of happiness, I wasn't ready for bad news or dramatic revelations. "Okay," I said carefully. "I love you, Maggie, not the memory of who you were, not the fantasy of who I thought you might become, but exactly who you are, right now, at this moment, in this life we're building together." The words I had been afraid to hope for, spoken with a sincerity that took my breath away. "I love you too," I said, and realized I had been waiting to say those words for months, afraid they were too much, too soon, or not enough, too late. We kissed as fireworks exploded overhead, two people who had learned that love doesn't always happen on schedule, that sometimes the best gifts come in packages you never expected to receive. Later, as we lay in my bed talking about the year that had passed and the year that lay ahead, Robert asked me a question that surprised me with its simplicity. "Are you happy, Maggie? Really, truly happy?" I considered the question seriously. Was I happy? I was certainly not the desperate, passionate happiness of my youth, when emotion felt like drowning and love seemed like the only thing that mattered in the world. This was something quieter, but no less real. The happiness of companionship and shared laughter, and the knowledge that I wasn't facing the future alone. "Yes," I said, "I'm happy. Are you?" "Happier than I've ever been, happier than I thought possible at our age." "What do you think David would say," I asked, "if he could see us now?" Robert was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think he'd say he's glad you found someone who appreciates what a remarkable woman you are." It was exactly what I needed to hear, and probably exactly what David would have said. He had always been generous with his love, secure in his place in my heart, even when I struggled with guilt about my past. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about the strange circling of time, the way life sometimes offers unexpected second acts to those brave enough to accept them. I thought about the girl I had been at 18, so certain that love had to be perfect and permanent, or it wasn't real at all. I thought about the woman I had become at 64, wise enough finally to understand that love comes in many forms and all of them have value. Most of all, I thought about hope and how it felt both dangerous and necessary, like oxygen to someone who had been holding her breath for too long. Tomorrow, Robert and I would wake up together and make coffee and read the newspaper and plan our day with the casual intimacy of people who have chosen each other deliberately, with full knowledge of the risks and rewards involved. We would water the bulbs we had planted, now showing the first green shoots of spring growth. We would call our children and make dinner plans and argue gently about what movie to watch. We would continue the careful, daily work of building a life together, not the dramatic, all-consuming love of our youth, but something steadier and more sustainable, something that honored both our past and our present. And if we were very lucky, we would have enough time to see it through to whatever ending awaited us. Because at our age, we understood finally that the ending wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the courage to begin again and again and again for as long as we were given the chance. I fell asleep smiling, my hand in Robert's, grateful beyond words for this unexpected gift of love in the winter of my life, this second chance I had never dared to dream might be possible.